We're going to go ahead and get started. And for those of you who are wondering why in the world we don't have questions this particular Sunday, in the words of Steve, good help is hard to find. Or more accurately, we're having some things, some issues on the back end, the member side of our website. If you go to our website, you'll see that we've done a little refresh of the design. And when that happened, there was some back end stuff with the member side that went sideways. And so we're in the process of figuring that out. But as a result, I wasn't able to send out the questions for this week. So what we're going to do today is go through the first half of the book of Hebrews. And I know you didn't get questions, so a lot of this is going to be cold turkey for a lot of you. But we are going to try to make the best of it here in looking at this book that is really fun just to look at and think about and to study. But there are some hard passages, and so we're just going to kind of do like we've done so many times before with some of the longer books, is to do a kind of a 30,000-foot flyover. We're not going to get bogged down in some of the details and some of the stuff, but we are going to try to address some of the things we see here in this book that I think is really funny and really cool. And also one of the things I like about it, I think there's some really awesome applications for us that hopefully we see as we work through this book together. The book of Hebrews was written to, this is going to shock you, to a group of Hebrews. Probably before 70 AD, because there's some a mention of sacrifices or implications that sacrifices were still going on. And so if sacrifices are still going on, you're writing to a group of Hebrews, what can we infer from that? That the temple is still standing. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD. So that's probably the case. But these Christians who were ethnic Hebrews, ethnic Jews, had obeyed the gospel, and because of all the trials and troubles and persecution and suffering and all the things that they were having to endure, it seems like they were thinking about giving up. And the writer of Hebrews, whoever he may be, comes along and writes this letter to say, don't give up. Hold on, because Jesus is better. And that's really what the book of Hebrews is all about. And so let's dive in there to the text with this very first question found there in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. That is, what stands out to you about the way Jesus is described there in those first 4 verses of Hebrews chapter 1? I'll go ahead and read it while you're thinking about it, because you didn't get a chance to get a heads up on this. So long ago, verse 1, God spoke to our ancestors by the prophets at different times in different ways. And in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, that God appointed him heir of all things and made the universe through him. That the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact expression of his nature, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After making purifications for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. And so he became superior to the angels, just as the name he inherited is more excellent than yours. What stands out to you about the way Jesus is described there in the first 4 verses? He's deity. He makes it very blunt that Jesus is God. What else? What else stands out to you about the way Jesus is described? He is God. What else?
Like when I read the Old Testament, like especially reading through Genesis, like the idea of the firstborn heir is so important and critical. Mm-hmm. And like knowing that that's so essential to Judaism, that's like the first thing he says is Jesus was appointed God's heir. Hard to be a bigger deal than that.
Yeah, and so he's deity, he's God. Caked on top of that, I think you're spot on to bring that up if you're a Jew and you know your story. and you know your heritage, you know how big a deal being the heir was. You think back to the patriarchs in Genesis. What else do you notice about how Jesus is described there in the text? Yeah. He's the, yeah. And that's one of those interesting themes you see several times in the New Testament, that we don't see Jesus explicitly mentioned on the pages of Genesis 1:1. We don't see Jesus' name appear in Genesis 1. But when you look ahead to John 1, the world was created through him. Colossians chapter 1, same thing. Hebrews chapter 1, same thing. That Jesus was actively, the New Testament tells us that Jesus was actively involved in creation. One of the things that you see, and I don't read Greek, so I'm relying on people who read Greek to tell me this, but people who read Greek and understand Greek tell us that this is some of the finest Greek. In fact, Hebrews itself is some of the finest Greek you'll read. It's just very well written. And when you look at the structure of Hebrews 1, verses 1 through 4, structurally, it is incredible. In fact, I can remember sitting when I worked for school, and I used to do recruiting, and I would go to preachers' meetings just to visit with preachers and build relationships with preachers. I remember one guy talking about in a session on Hebrews that Hebrews begins with this, like the first verse or two is every word or every other word is this, begins with the same sound. It's like psst, psst, psst. It's like alliteration all over the place, which helps you remember it. Which is led, by the way, as we think about the book, some to suggest that it's so alliterative and so that it's designed to be read. That it was perhaps a sermon originally, a sermon that was recorded. Which leads us down a rabbit hole of who wrote the book a little further. But we won't talk about that today. But I tell you that to kind of let you know this is a really cool book, and there's some things that they're trying to emphasize very, very intelligently and rhetorically here in the first couple of verses. Chris, and then Todd, I can't tell, Todd, if you're thinking, your hand's up. So Chris.
No, it was up. I might retract it.
Yeah.
Hebrews is one of those books where you really do have to try and become a Jew. Because it's rich in imagery and it speaks to the Jewish person. So if we don't understand that and try and take that on, what it would mean, what it meant to have the blood of sacrifices being poured out again and again and again, the importance of the high priest as an intervention point, and just on and on and on. If you don't understand that to some extent, then you're going to miss a bunch of what the Hebrew writer has said, because that, first and foremost, is who he's writing to. The context is to that audience in that day and age.
I think you're spot on. And I think one of the things that may help us as we think about the book of Hebrews is as we read it, it's like pulling back layers of an onion. Like the more we understand, the better we can put ourselves, as Chris has said, in the mind of a first century Jew. Potentially even more specifically, the mind of a first century Jew who is Hellenized in the sense that they speak Greek perhaps as a native language. It helps us understand some of the things and that this book is telling us, that we have to understand their world and these images. In fact, some people have said that to really understand this book, like to really understand, like pull back all the layers of the onion, as it were, you need to understand Leviticus. And how many of us like studying the book of Leviticus? Okay, we're going to talk afterwards because we're talking about Leviticus next year. So I think we just found our teacher for Leviticus next year. Thank you for volunteering. I'm a big picture guy. In fact, we were talking, Kevin and I were talking, was it Wednesday? Kevin likes details, and so since he likes details, Leviticus is a great book. I'm a big picture guy. And so getting bogged down in all those details is kind of overwhelming for me. So thank you for volunteering.
So, I guess I start Genesis 1, although it doesn't name Jesus, it does use plural. It uses us, we, hour. And I think to Chris's point, but what's also very important, and we always have to remember that we're reading somebody else's mail here, and
Yeah.
there is some language in this book, in this letter, that we can really get hung up on. And I always, as far as Hebrews goes, think of chapter 2, when the writer uses the phrase descendants of Abraham. And I think a lot of times we like to call ourselves descendants of Abraham, and in a way, yeah, we are, but that's not what the writer means. So I think, to Chris's point, is you have, maybe I see it differently, I would say you have to remember this is written to Jews, we're not Jews.
Yeah.
And so we can't make that direct correlation. This is not written to us.
Yeah.
It's preserved for us.
I like the image, we're reading somebody else's mail. I love that image. And sometimes when you read other people's mail, I don't make a habit of that. But in the event you were, there are certain content things that may be part of the ongoing relationship, previous emails that you haven't read, that may be mentioned or inferred or connected to the one that you do get a chance to read. Yes, Steve?
Building on those thoughts a little bit, and
Yeah.
probably where you're trying to get to, as you've been unpacking this, John 14:9 comes to my mind quickly, that Jesus said, if you have seen me, you've seen the Father.
Yeah.
There's this reality that's being unpacked here, that you can't see Jesus and not see God. They are deity, and that's just an animal like you.
Yeah.
You don't really comprehend how exactly intimately they are the same.
Yeah.
And so Hebrews becomes this, for Jews, a very difficult book, because they're trying in some ways to say Jesus was a smart guy, but,
Yeah.
and from the beginning, the Hebrew writer is saying, if you've seen Jesus, you have seen God. There is no difference.
He's going, and just to kind of continue the train of thought as we think about Jesus here in the text, angels were a big deal in Second Temple Judaism. And what's the first thing he goes after to say Jesus is better?
Mm-hmm.
Starting there in verse 5. Jesus is better than the angels. All those supernatural beings that you have all this mythology, I don't say mythology is the best word I can come up with. I'm not, this ideas and all these kind of stories and ideas and concepts of, Jesus is even better than them. Jesus is better than all those angels that you've thought of there in the text. And as we continue through the story, in fact, if you look at verse 5 through 14 in Hebrews chapter 1, my Bible bolds quotations. How does your Bible tell you this is a quotation from the Old Testament? Does it do anything?
Good caps.
Caps?
Quotation marks.
Quotation marks. That's helpful. That's helpful. You know why it's helpful, Kevin? Because you don't know if he's telling you a conversation or if he's quoting something. How else does your Bible tell you it's
Footnotes.
footnotes? Italics? Okay. I've seen some that will do, like mine's bold, the all caps. I've seen some will actually indent it a little bit and maybe bold it as well. It's the translators and the Bible publishers' way of saying, heads up. He's quoting the Old Testament. And quotations from the Old Testament are all over the place in Hebrews. In fact, I found this in one commentary this week. There are at least 38 quotations, direct quotations from the Old Testament, and many more allusions. They suggested there may be as many as 55. And even more echoes of Old Testament passages. The book of Hebrews is 13 chapters long. At 38 quotations, that means there are at least 3 quotations a chapter. With 55 allusions, that means there's 5 allusions a chapter at that account. There are a lot, 5 or 6. Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, it's interesting, as he starts off here, and this is a cultural thing, right? We're facts folks. We list out
Yeah.
stuff and we do this stuff.
Yeah.
He starts in the Psalms.
Yeah.
His description of to which angel did he ever say
Yeah.
this? But to my son, he says, it's all either by direct quotation or by allusion.
Yeah.
Psalms.
Yeah.
And I find that interesting because in our culture, in the way that we operate and I'm talking church culture,
Yeah.
we go to lists and we want details and we want the facts.
Yeah.
Right? But that's not because Jesus, if you're going to understand Jesus as a Jew, you're going to understand him as a prophet, a priest, and a king in poetry. It's beautiful. It's rich. And I think that's why it starts this way.
Well, to your point there, Chris, going back to verses 1 through 4, I'm glad you brought that up. Because there in chapter 1 and verse 2, in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son. Who did God speak to in the Old Testament? The prophets. He is the radiance of his glory, the exact expression of his nature, sustaining all things by his powerful word, making purifications for sin. Who made purification for sins in the Hebrews? Priests. And there he sat down at the right hand on the majesty on high, and he's superior to the angels. Who sits down at the right hand? That's a king. Prophet, priest, and king. And so there at the very introduction of the book, he is emphasizing that Jesus is our prophet, priest, and king. Kevin.
Yeah. I mean, going back to verse 1, like he says, God spoke to our fathers
Yeah.
by the prophets.
Yeah.
And like the fathers, the patriarchs were like, that was it for Judaism. And then the prophets. And so, kind of going back to Chris's comment about factualness,
Yeah.
I read in verse 1 and I was like, cite your sources, dude. Like, who, like, what is,
Well-
like, what fathers, what prophets? But
Yeah.
then he does it. Like,
Yeah.
he has a few sentences and then he says, now he quotes Psalms.
Yeah.
I'm like, to them, like, that is
Yeah.
their fathers, that is
Yeah.
their prophets. And so, like, I think that, like, for him, to who he's communicating to, like,
Yeah.
this is really impactful.
And I'm glad, like, that bringing in how he uses the Psalms, especially right off the bat, because the Psalms are poetry. And as Chris pointed out, we like facts. And what's so interesting, and this is kind of like how maybe different we think, that we expect the writer to come out and say, this is a connection. I am stealing this idea. I'm quoting this idea from this verse. The Hebrews, as I understand that, didn't do that. They would just say it, and they expect you to make the connection. That you should be well versed enough in the scriptures to know immediately that there in verse 5 that he is quoting Psalm 2. And Psalm 2 was the psalm that was read at the coronation for kings. And you're making that connection. And you're going down, and as he's quoting these psalms, you're making these connections in your mind because you understand how these things were used. Now, like his use of psalms, and there's a book I'm going to get eventually. It just came out like in the last 6 months. I have not purchased it yet. Psalms 110. There's a book written on Psalms 110 and its impact on the theology of Hebrews. It's going to be in my library eventually, just not quite yet. Just because that psalm is so important for this book. But let's go on, because I don't want us to get bogged down too much in the details, and go on to chapter 2 that he said already. Here he is, that Jesus is our prophet, priest, and king. He's better than the angels. And there in chapter 2, he issues the first of 5 warnings here in the book. And this first warning is about drifting. Look what he says there in chapter 2 and verse 1. For this reason, we must pay attention all the more to what we have heard. Real quickly, as we read these 4 verses, pay attention to how often you hear the word speak and word. Honestly, pay attention to those words throughout the book. Pay attention to what we have heard, so that we will not drift away. For if the message spoken through the angels was legally binding, and every transgression and disobedience received a just punishment, how will we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? That this salvation had its beginning when it was spoken of by the Lord and confirmed to us by those who heard him. At the same time, God also testified by signs and wonders and various miracles and distributions of gifts from the Holy Spirit according to his will. So there, as we read Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 1, what does drifting look like in real life? Remember who he's writing to while you're thinking about that. Remember who he's writing to. Some Jews who had believed the gospel. They were starting to suffer. They were starting to wonder if it was worth it. And they were hanging on for dear life, if you'll allow me to use that analogy. So he writes this book and issues this warning right here. It says, don't drift. Don't fall away. Yeah.
Well, it's when they start paying attention.
Yeah.
And always through the Jewish history, it's when they stop paying attention to
Yeah.
the things that God had told them to
Yeah.
do, is when they drifted apart.
Yeah.
And he's warning them not to keep repeating that particular pattern.
I like that you caught on not paying attention, and you're connecting it back to the story of Israel, because how often in their story does that failure to pay attention happen? Pretty much every generation. Like, I love the way the author of Judges puts it, like the generation of Joshua that saw the Red Sea, the Jordan divide, that saw the walls of Jericho fall down. After them arose a generation that didn't know the Lord. Why? Because they stopped paying attention and didn't know the things that he had done for them. And what happened? Well, the book of Judges, which is kind of like the Bible's version of a bloody, gory book on so many levels. So yeah, they need to pay attention. What else do you see that maybe helps us understand what drifting looks like in real life? Allison's family has a boat. And you guys know already that I am dead scared of water. And so when we go out in the boat, the life jacket does not come off. And on the rare occasion I do get in the water, with the life jacket on, of course, you know what I'm doing the entire time? Where's the boat? Like, I don't want that boat to drift away. I want the shore within sight, and I want that boat within a couple of strides. Because I can't swim. And so I'm always paying attention to where that boat is. Going back to what Gina said a moment ago. To keep us from drifting away, we always have to pay attention to where Jesus is. What else is this passage teaching us about drifting? Yeah.
We're using your story, drifting slow.
Yeah.
It's not something that happens fast.
Yeah.
It's hard to recognize sometimes.
100%. And that's the thing about being on the lake with her family. Like, you're over here, you're having a good time, I'm playing with my nieces and nephews, and if I don't pay attention, the boat that was 10 feet away is now 20 or 30. And even with a life jacket on, and my weird ability to doggy paddle with a life jacket, that is not a very comfortable, fun thing to get back to the boat. So it's something that happens slowly. Most people don't wake up on Monday morning and say, okay, I'm done with church, I'm never going back. It's usually something that happens over a period of time. Chris, I saw your hand.
Yeah, so first of all, learn to swim. If you're going to live here, man, learn to swim. All right? But drifting for them, these were a part of the remnant that had come back. And so drifting is going to be housed in idolatry and housed in adultery.
Yeah.
Those are the two sort of cornerstones that are there. And so that's what drifting looks like. Drifting looks like moving away from God.
Yeah.
And whatever form it takes. But for them, in this context, I think they would hearken back to that. Because that's when the remnant came back, idolatry And the type of worship, honestly, that they're seeing from other gods in the area was extracted from Judaism.
Yeah. So I want to unpack some things that Chris just said, because I'm glad you did. Drifting happens slowly, and he's connecting to their story. Let's go all the way back to the beginning of Israel's story, to Exodus. When Moses goes up on the mountain, and they start panicking because Moses has been gone for a long time, what do? Build the golden calf. And they're like, this is our God. This is Yahweh. This is the Lord. It's not another God. They build the calf as a resemblance of Yahweh and the Lord. And then you look later down to Pat. That's the first drift. They make the idol for God, an image of the true God. And then later down the story, they start adding the other gods. And they start by serving God in Molech or God in Baal. And eventually what happens, God becomes down here. Baal and Molech and the other gods in El become the primary gods. And that happens slowly. It didn't happen quickly. That's their story, and they know that. They know the dangers of drifting because they know they can go back in their minds to Genesis or to Exodus or to Leviticus and to Numbers and to Deuteronomy. They know the stories about their history and drifting. Drifting is
So not being a Jew, but I would imagine, when they became a Christian, there was probably still a lot of Jewish traditional things they kept doing.
Yeah.
Right? And there were probably people in their family that did not convert to Christianity. So I imagine they probably still celebrated some of the Jewish festivals. So it would be very easy you're still doing that, right? And
great point.
To say, oh, well, you know what,
Yeah.
so.
That's a great point, because you see that in the New Testament, how the implication for several passages in the New Testament is a lot of the Jews continue to practice circumcision. It wasn't required, but they continued to practice it. They continued perhaps to go to synagogue. They continued to go to Jerusalem and practice some of the laws. They didn't have to, but they continued to, because that was so ingrained in who they were. Yeah.
Okay, and I'm going to apologize before
Okay.
I even ask that.
We know a doozy's is coming.
Well, this whole section, whoever wrote this, I don't know, pick Barnabas. Let's just pick somebody. He's writing this, and the writer in this section, this first section, is comparing Christ and angels. Christ is so much better than angels.
Yeah.
But as we end chapter 1, verses 13 and 14, just 14 says, are they not all ministering spirits sent out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation? He's talking about angels. They are just the blue collar guys.
Yeah.
So then, this is just a continuing thought in chapter 2. But verse 2, kind of for me is a bit of a monkey wrench in the gears, because verse 2 says, for if, we're talking about drifting, right? It says, for if the word spoken through angels proved unalterable. It's kind of a, can we rely on an angel's word? I'm guessing maybe not so much.
Okay.
That's why I apologize to you.
Okay.
Because this can go down a bunny trail here. And every transgression and disobedience received a just recompense. How shall we escape if we neglect so when he's saying drifting, just my thought here, it almost seems to me like he's saying, okay, one of the ways you can prevent yourself from your anchor slipping is don't put a lot of faith and confidence in what you have heard and learned about angels being authoritative. They're not.
Why are you saying that in verse 2, how are you,
I know.
I don't understand how you're saying that that's, because it sounds he's exactly saying, like my translation says, the message declared by angels proved to be reliable.
Yeah, mine uses if there.
Yeah, mine says for since.
Yeah, so, and maybe this is a translational thing.
So
to
like,
me-
can I offer mine?
Oh, yeah,
on it?
please do.
Because like when I read this, I think like, and I don't know all the stuff about the new temple. I know there's a lot of writing about angels and stuff.
Yeah.
However, we can reflect back on angels that we've seen throughout the Old Testament because we've seen that plenty of times. And their message was they are the messengers of God. They are spiritual beings in the presence of God, and they carry His message and His authority, sometimes to execute judgment.
Right. And they have,
great
those
power.
ones have names.
Yeah. So to me, reading it makes sense to read it as they are the messengers of God. They have His authority as His messengers, so their message is reliable. Like your fathers in the Old Testament did not question the angels. Like most of them trembled in fear and fell on their faces before the angels. So if their message was reliable, then how are you going to disregard the Son's message? So like if God can give authority to the angels and their message is reliable, then like, are you gonna dare neglect listening to the Son's message? And it makes me think of that parable about like the vineyard owner sending messengers back and the evil workers keep killing the messengers and then he sends the son back and they kill the son. Like that's what this kind of harkens to me. So it seems like it's explicitly saying the angels are reliable, like they are from God. You listen to them. And now you're going to say you're not going to listen to the Son.
Chris has his hand up.
Yeah, for me, I think verse 14 that they're saying whether it's an angel or whether it's Jesus, they're all ministering spirits. And what we knew is everything the angel's message came true. You know what Christ's message?
Yeah.
How are you? Do you think it's changed?
Yeah.
I don't think it's changed, right? So in that, even though He's greater than angels, for who did He say, about the angels? But even though God is greater, His Son, He said way better things about His Son. They're all ministering spirits.
Yeah.
So that's the way I
And I kind of feel like I want to check myself here, but we also know if I or an angel teach you a different gospel. It almost feels like an apostolic authority question. And I think I want to quit because I think we're going to go somewhere we don't.
Yeah. Well, I have a couple of quick thoughts. Like for me, it reads almost, I think it's geometry when high school. This is one of those if-then type proofs. And I'm seeing some head shaking. Maybe that doesn't bring back nightmares like it does for me, but it seems like it's almost one of those geometry proofs. If the message of the angels was legally binding, and I look over to Galatians chapter 3, and it talks about the Galatians were the ones who delivered the message to mediators and so on and so forth. And every transgression then, when the angels delivered it, received a punishment, then how much more will the message delivered by the Son lead to punishment for those who drift? That's what I read there in the text. Kevin, you had your hand up.
That was actually literally
Okay.
what I was going to say. Can I make a second comment?
You're allowed to sometimes.
Because I was also thinking about the angels a lot, like how much we talked about angels and drifting. And I was reflecting in my own life. When I lose sight of the spiritual world and my connection to it, that's when I start to drift.
Yeah.
And so when he gives the warning, pay attention to what you heard, and like he is reminding them, like angels are inherently spiritual beings, and he's reminding them of prophetic words, and in verse 4 he talks about the miracles and the Holy Spirit. Like he is really calling them to remember. Like I think in Judaism, like it's so easy for it to become a concrete physical religion. I mean, I think that's a temptation for all of us in anything, but like so much of the actions of worship were these concrete things that were meant to represent something spiritual, but in their world, they're being persecuted as Christians, but it would have been safe to be a Jew.
Yeah.
And the writer or speaker here is reminding them of like there is a spiritual world at play here that has been in existence, always has been, and you are part of it. To me, that's part of what's going on here. Is like he is really calling their attention back to the spiritual existence that they are part of.
And I think that fits into the train of thought. Going back to Chris's comment at the very beginning of class, we need to think like Hebrews. I read in a book somewhere, as he says later in verse 5 or verse 6, someone somewhere has testified. I read somewhere that someone said. Okay, so just that you can find instances in Jewish literature and Jewish art dating back to this time frame where you have angels all over the place, and like there's this depiction of like a spiritual war going on around us that we don't see, this unseen battle, this unseen war. I wish I could remember where I read that. I went looking for it about a month or 2 or 3 ago, and I couldn't find it. But I think it ties into what he's saying here in the text in terms of understanding that you and I, we kind of deal even today in this concrete world that what we can see, and he's reminding them, hey guys, there's the angels out there too. And he's bringing them back and connecting them to that. Just kind of moving on a little bit.
Just let me,
Real quick, Steve. There you go.
I'm picking up on Lori's vision of Jews in their family setting, trying to figure out how to move on to this new thing and yet being held by this old thing because of, so I think that's a very good real picture that we all at some level have to struggle with because of this one reason. In Romans, we're told that God is both just and the justifier. Well, what does it mean to be just? What it means to be just, I think, is that all men for all time, when they are called to accountability for their lives, whether they lived under the law of conscience, whether they lived under the old law, or they live under the new law, at the end of the day, they're all interrelated or God can't be just. If one law is dramatically different than the other, then we can stand up and say, that's not fair. They got a better deal than I did. That's what makes this whole conversation so complicated, is that in order for God to be just, there is something in all of them that binds them all together. Or Mark wouldn't be able to say the gospel as it was revealed in Isaiah.
Yeah.
This is a complex thing we're talking about here.
And it's a complex thing that they had to deal with that impacted the life of the early church. Going back to, that's why they have Romans 14, just to kind of bring that into the picture. You guys are familiar with Romans 14 and Romans 14 issues where matters of judgment, matters of opinion, as they're trying to wrestle with what does it mean to be in Christ. And even today, I have family that's done some ministry work up in the Mid-Atlantic and New England. And they have people in their congregations who came out of Catholicism. And because of their background in Catholicism and Christmas, for example, we're in the holiday season, because of Christmas being so big a deal in the Catholic Church, and it's the birth of Jesus, and the whole thing, the whole shindig that you see in that world, that they can't celebrate Christmas. They like for them, making a clean break with everything in the past. And so they can't they don't celebrate Christmas. Whereas maybe some of us may go, we'll get together with family, we'll exchange gifts. That's what's going on in the first century. These Jews are struggling. How do you make a break? Can I keep the Passover, but still be a Christian? Like, what does that break look like? Chris has his hand up, and then Todd. Go.
Just that, I mean, we're not going to have any time to get through this today,
not.
But this is not, a lot of times when we see chapters, we think of vignettes or novellas or something like that. That's not what this is. This is a narrative. If you look at their chapter breaks, therefore, now the point is, this is the reason. It's all building on each other. And so and this is a danger that we have, you hop in and you jump into Hebrews chapter 9 or Hebrews chapter 10 and you haven't gotten the whole story from the beginning, you're going to make some misapplications. And it's just an encouragement to read this first and foremost in its entirety as a letter, as somebody writing a letter, not somebody who created 13 different novellas.
Yeah, and I love that. Like the more if you ever have a chance, and I know it's busy, it's the holiday season this afternoon, you're going to spend time with family, eat lunch with family, you're going to go out, maybe do some Christmas shopping, or whatever the case is, get on Amazon if you haven't done your Cyber Monday, Black Friday stuff. I know it's busy this time of year, but if you have a chance just to sit down, grab a cup of coffee and read Hebrews, and just follow the train of thought, it will help you not only understand the book of Hebrews in context, but it'll help you prepare for next week. Todd?
I'll be quick. So there's a reason why we don't know all there is to know about angels. We don't have.
Yeah.
We don't know what Jude was talking about in Jude 9. They did.
Yeah.
And the same with these Hebrew recipients. They knew more about what the writer was talking about with angels than we do. The only reason you can come up with it, we don't have the answer, we don't need it.
Yeah.
It was a real deep discussion here.
Why did I think I could do Hebrews, 6 chapters of Hebrews? Man, we got 2.5
It was a
chapters.
great discussion.
Go ahead.
But one of the meat and potato things that we could get out of here in these first 4 verses is verse 4 that I hold on to. As we talk to people nowadays and you have confusion in the Christian, faith, you have books out now, miracles around us, that's a big book right now, right? This is a go-to verse in verse 4, well, starting in the last part of verse 3 for us that we can use. What were miracles for? It was to confirm the word from the messenger, right? And then we could go to John 3. But that's a basic thing that we could take out of this and use and apply it to us as we're talking to people in the world now. Because there is a confusion out there. Miracles, miracles. I mean, they go as far as thinking miracles. If you ever go through Mississauga Highlands and you go through every one of those lights and it turns green from you from one spot, that's a miracle in people's eyes. But this is a place that we could go to simply teach us, what were the miracles for? If you want to start a dialogue with people.
That's a good point there in verse 4. And we are almost out of time. In fact, we're at 10:14. We'll go a little farther. We'll go a little farther into Hebrews chapter 3. So he's made this, introduced Jesus as better than the prophets in the first 4 verses of chapter 1. He's better than the angels. Made that first warning. He comes to Hebrews chapter 3 and he says he's better than Moses. Again, going back to what we said at the very beginning of class with, I think it was Chris's comment, put yourself in a Jewish mind, a Hebrew mind. Who is Moses to you? He's the lawgiver. He's everything. He's your George Washington meets Abraham Lincoln meets FDR. Like, he's your dude. And yet, he says Jesus is better than Moses. And there's a lot of things going on in the first 6 verses that we do not have time to deal with today. But then he goes on in verse 7 as he talks to these Christians who are struggling, and he issues another warning, the second warning. And it's a quotation, this is going to shock you, from one of the Psalms. Psalm 95. And what's his point? What's the parallel that he's trying to draw here in Hebrews chapter 3 between Israel and these early Christians who are struggling? What's the parallel? These Israel's story, looking back, how they hardened their hearts.
They were going back to the way they lived.
They're going back. They're drifting and they're going back. What are Christians doing here?
Same thing, they're going back to Judah.
They're going back. You're going backwards. What else? What are there some other parallels? I love that parallel. What's another parallel?
One of my favorite ones in Hebrews. I got my Bible closed, but he tells them, why did they wander in the wilderness and they didn't get to go in the land of rest? Symbolically, heaven is because they did it because of disbelief. Or does it say obey first? But disbelief is equal to unbelief.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, belief is obedience also.
Yeah. That's great as well. The unbelief, they have hardened hearts. And look at verse 12 real quickly. This will be the final thing we think about today. Watch out, brothers and sisters, so that they won't be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. In verse 13. But encourage each other daily. If you do have a chance this week to read 13 chapters and read the entire book, we are going to go over chapters 7 through 13 next Sunday. We are just going to skip ahead. We may do a quick summary at the very beginning, but that's going to be our goal. That's where we're going. If you get a chance to read the entire book, just sit down with a good cup of coffee and just read. Pay attention to how many times not only there's a warning, maybe mark the warnings if you're a person who likes to write in your Bible. Mark the warnings in your Bible, but also mark the times that you see encourage one another. If you're a Jewish Christian in the first century and you're thinking about giving up and they're struggling and you're wrestling with it and you're wondering if you should just go back because it was comfortable and no one's going to make fun of you because you're a Jew. It was an old religion. It was a legal religion in the Roman Empire. No one's going to make fun of you. And then you go to church that Sunday. You gather with your brothers and sisters in Christ. And you're encouraged. That makes a difference. There's value in us getting together every Sunday and every chance we get to spend time together, to build relationships, to open the Word together, to discuss the Scriptures together, and to learn from one another, and to get to know one another, and to get to encourage one another. On that note, class dismissed.